Okay, at long last, it's time to talk about the Civil War, and we ain't got no time to waste, so if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, let's get to it. Okay, so we left off in the last video with the secession of the southern states after the election of Abraham Lincoln, and at that point the Confederacy in the South was born, and they were perfectly happy to enact the divorce and live the rest of their days in peace and slavery. But Abraham Lincoln was not in fact content with such an arrangement. He believed that secession was a constitutional impossibility, and therefore he was ready to do whatever it took to bring those sassy and wayward southern states back into the Union. But ready and committed as he was, Lincoln did not relish leading the Union to fire the first shot. And so that's when he put his pondering pants on, and all of a sudden a solution presented itself. Oh, by the way, if you want Noteguides to follow along with this video and all my videos, check that link in the description. Anyway, right here in South Carolina was a federal fort called Fort Sumter. And let's not rush too quickly past that because the details are important. South Carolina was the first to secede, and that means it was very much part of the Confederacy. But this fort is controlled and staffed by federal or Union soldiers. And as it turned out, in April of 1861, these Union troops needed fresh supplies of food and munitions. And that's when the light bulb over Lincoln's head went off and he decided to send Union ships to resupply the fort. And so at that point, the president of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, had a decision to make. On one hand, the South's whole strategy was simply to be left alone. On the other, it just wouldn't do to have a functioning Union fort staffed with Union soldiers within Confederate territory. Therefore, Davis made the decision to fire on the Union ship and apply pressure to the soldiers within the fort. And 2 days later, the Union soldiers surrendered, but now that shots had been fired, Lincoln had all the justification he needed to prosecute a war against the Confederacy and attempt to save the Union. And, well, that's exactly what he did. So look, I hate to be the guy who spoils the ending of something, but here's where I tell you that the Union won the war. And sorry if you didn't already know, but honestly, where you been? Anyway, the point is, when the war began, it was in no way clear that the Union would win because each side had their distinct advantages and disadvantages, and we'll break those down into three categories. First, let's consider population. Now, the advantage here was for sure toward the Union. I mean, the northern population was almost 5 times as large as the Confederate population since it was home to the biggest cities in the US, while the Confederacy was mainly agricultural and not as densely populated. And in case you yourself have never prosecuted a war, let me tell you that having more people to throw in front of enemy gunfire is always a big advantage. Okay, second, let's talk economics. Now, the Union was home to the vast majority of the United States' economic resources, including banks and factories and railroads. And all of that combined meant that it would be easier for the North to continue paying for the war as it dragged on. However, despite that advantage, we cannot forget about King Cotton. You see, the South still generated enormous wealth by growing and exporting cotton both internationally and domestically. And that actually was a massive advantage for them. And why, says you? Well, says I, powerful states like Great Britain and France depended heavily on the export of Southern cotton, and that meant Confederate leaders might be able to use that dependence to secure an alliance against the Union. And as we'll see in the next video, unfortunately for them, that did not work out. And finally, third, let's talk about leadership. Now, in the beginning of the war, Confederates had by far the more talented generals. You had generals like Robert E. Lee and Thomas Stonewall Jackson, who were brilliant and decisive and scored early victories for the South. I mean, the guy's nickname was Stonewall, and I think that'd be enough to make the Union lines poop their pants. Anyway, part of the advantage Confederate generals had is that they were fighting a defensive war, which meant that they had shorter supply lines and held kind of a home field advantage against the invaders from the north. Anyway, in contrast, Lincoln up in the north for sure had general problems. Like, none of his generals seemed to act as aggressively and decisively as Lincoln wanted, and as a result of their timidity, the war just dragged on and on. However, by the end of the war, Lincoln appointed Ulysses S. Grant as general of the Union armies, and at long last, here was a general who was ready to butcher those rebellious Southerners. Okay, so each side had their advantages and disadvantages, but both the North and the South waged total war against the other. And by definition, a total war describes a conflict in which combatants leverage all the resources of their economies and societies to secure victory in the conflict. In other words, in total war, it doesn't matter if you're a soldier or a woman on a farm or whatever, everyone had to contribute in their own way to victory. Now, certainly in the beginning, both sides thought that this would be a quick war if they made the right strategic moves. I mean, look at these people right here. These were picnickers who came out to watch the first major battle of the war because they thought it would be kind of cute and a good way to pass the afternoon. But it was a bloodbath, and so were many of the following battles, and that convinced both sides that this would be a long and protracted war. And the longer the war stretched, the more it became clear that total war was the only option. Now, probably the most widespread manifestation of total war was the introduction on both sides of a military draft, which legally required men in a certain age range to fight in the conflict. However, the success of the draft was very different in the South and in the North. In the South, the Confederate draft was always facing problems, and I'll mention two of the most significant. First, remember the Confederacy drafted a constitution that majored heavily heavily on states' rights because they were still saucy about the concentration of federal power in the United States. And so while that whole states' rights thing was great for protecting slavery, it was in fact not great for fighting a war, since the Confederate government had very little constitutional power to compel men to fight. And that meant some men simply ignored the draft, and that weakened the Confederate effort over time. But the second problem was the inequality of the draft. You see, the draft law allowed for the exemption of one white planter for every 20 enslaved people he owned. And that was mainly to keep the Southern economy strong during the war, because without the planters, King Cotton might be demoted to Prince Cotton, or, horror of horrors, Duke Cotton, and that was unthinkable. But then, in addition, the law allowed a drafted man to pay a fee in order to hire a substitute to fight in his place. And so these policies became a real problem for the Confederacy, because it meant that the rich folk could avoid the war while the poor were forced to fight to preserve the wealth of the elite. Now, the Union also implemented a draft law, and it was certainly more successful on account of the greater centralized power in the federal government. However, like the South, this law faced resistance as well. So the Union draft law also had provisions for wealthy men to pay for substitutes, and that caused similar resentment. And the Union had plenty of draft dodgers as well, but in the North it was handled a little different. You see, Lincoln had already gone full hog into his executive power and suspended habeas corpus, which is a constitutional guarantee that citizens must be told why they're being arrested. I mean, it's a good thing on principle to know why you're being arrested, but it also really slows down the process of arrest in order to make sure everything is above board. So he had done this in response to mob action in Maryland when angry crowds tried to obstruct Union troops from traveling. And so in response, Lincoln justified suspending this constitutional guarantee because these mobs were interfering with national security and because Congress was not in session at the time. Anyway, back to those who tried to evade the draft. Lincoln didn't have time to habeas anyone's corpus, he had a war to win. And so Lincoln authorized the arrest of something like 15,000 draft dodgers and Southern sympathizers who were undermining the Union war effort. However, that use of federal power also caused some resistance as well. In 1863, mostly Irish immigrants rioted for 5 days in what became known as the New York City draft riots. And the reasons for this violent uprising are tied to several themes that we've already touched in this unit. You see, although many of the Irish in New York had become citizens and had become somewhat successful in winning local political offices, nativists lashed out against them with constant and demeaning racial insults and resistance. Also, it was 1863, and that was the year Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed all the enslaved population in the Confederacy. And I'll tell you all about that in the next video, but for now you just need to realize that the Irish working class resented it because it meant that more free black people would be competing for their jobs. And finally, due to the provision in the draft law that allowed wealthy men to pay for a substitute, these working class Irish who could not afford such a substitute grew all kinds of resentful. And so that resentment boiled over into a riot that began as a resistance to the draft law, but quickly turned into a race riot in which crowds directed their violence against black New Yorkers. And the riots were only quelled once Lincoln sent federal troops to New York fresh off the battlefield in Gettysburg. Okay, like I said earlier, the Union won the war, even though in the beginning that was not for sure the certain outcome. So let's finish by considering the 3 reasons for the Union victory. First, you've got improvements in leadership and strategy. So recall that I said earlier that the Confederates for sure had the better generals in the beginning of the war. And that was on full display in the First Battle of Bull Run in 1861. And by the way, the Confederates called this the Battle of Manassas, but it's the same thing, so, don't get confused. Anyway, this was the first major battle of the war, and it also happens to be the battle I mentioned earlier that attracted all the picnickers looking for some good entertainment. Anyway, Lincoln hoped that by securing a quick victory in the Confederate capital of Richmond, that the war would be over in a matter of weeks. And while Union General Irvin McDowell did strike a hard blow, the Confederate army responded with unexpected force, which sent Union soldiers fleeing into Washington. And so this battle proved to Lincoln that the strength of the Confederacy was not to be underestimated, and it also squashed whatever hopes he had about bringing the war to a quick end. But more importantly, it began Lincoln's long process of appointing and replacing generals whom he felt were incompetent to match the skill of their Confederate counterparts. However, a general leading Union forces in the West, namely Ulysses S. Grant, scored a major victory in 1863 that gave Lincoln hope that he had found a leader who could win the war for the Union. And one of those major victories was the Siege of Vicksburg. So a vital part of Lincoln's strategy was to control the Mississippi River, but a key Confederate fort at Vicksburg prevented it. And so Grant executed a nearly 2-month siege at the fort, and in the end, 29,000 Confederate soldiers surrendered. And that victory secured the Mississippi River for strategic Union use and achieved Lincoln's goal of cutting the Confederacy in half. And as it happened, the victory at Vicksburg coincided with the Union victory at Gettysburg, which was a significant turning point in the war, which turned the tide in favor of the Union. And as a result, Lincoln called Grant back east and promoted him to become the general of all the Union's armies. And related to this was the second reason for Union victory, namely the North's greater resources. So a key part of Grant's strategy moving forward was to fight a war of attrition, meant to cut off Confederate supplies and wear them down until fighting became an impossibility. And owing to the Union's superior wealth and population and industry, a war of attrition was a viable strategy. Additionally, as the war dragged on, Southern morale waned significantly because of the increasing hardships that they were facing. You see, many Southerners resented the Confederate government, which they felt was both overstepping its authority and at the same time not doing enough to address the suffering of the Confederate population. For example, in 1863, a series of bread riots riots broke out in several states across the Confederacy on account of people couldn't afford basic provisions to feed their families. And that was due to many factors like out-of-control inflation on prices and an increasing amount of food being sent to feed troops. Therefore, rioting broke out, which was initially led by women, and the mobs looted grocery stores in order to find bread and other basic necessities. And so, all in all, the riots communicated that a good number of Confederate citizens believed that their government was neglecting their needs, and that had a way of seriously deflating support for the Confederate cause. And then the third reason for Union victory was its strategy to destroy Southern infrastructure, the most infamous example being Sherman's march to the sea. So in order to fully demoralize and incapacitate the South, Grant sent General William Tecumseh Sherman to invade and capture Atlanta, which was a major railroad hub for the Confederacy. And as Sherman marched his army from Chattanooga to Atlanta, he commanded his men to employ a scorched earth strategy, which is to say he told them to destroy everything in their path. And when they got to Atlanta, Sherman's troops fought and defeated Confederate armies after a protracted siege and then went ahead and set the city on fire. Now, it was a devastating loss for the South, and it meant that transporting troops and supplies by rail would become infinitely more difficult. But as it turns out, Sherman was hungry for a little more destruction, and so he proposed to Grant that his men march from Atlanta to Savannah while continuing to deploy their scorched earth strategy. So Grant approved, and the march destroyed vital food supplies and railroads required by the Confederates. And there are so many other examples I can give you that illustrate all the reasons for Union victories, but that's going to do for our purposes. Now, the war finally came to an end in 1865 when Grant gained control of a strategic railroad junction in Virginia and then cut off the Confederate Army's escape route. And after that, General Lee knew without a doubt that the South was defeated. And so he met Grant in the Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia and formally surrendered, and the war was over. Well, okay, you can click here to watch my other videos for Unit 5, or you can click here to grab my video note guides, which are going to help you get all the contents of this course firmly crammed into your brain folds. I'm glad you came around, and I'll catch you on the flip-flop. Heimler out.